unreeled. Vintage recordings of fiction recovered from discontinued physical media.
As You Like It. Shakespeare's comedy As You Like It was probably first performed in about 1599. It is a love story, set not in some far-off or imaginary land, but in the forest of Arden, in the Warwickshire countryside that Shakespeare knew as a boy. Shakespeare borrowed the plot from a romantic story called Rosalind, and it is Rosalind who is the heroine of his play. She is the driving force of the action, witty, intelligent, and charming, and a match for any of the men. Rosalind's father is a duke, but he has been supplanted by his wicked brother Frederick, who remains at court while the duke lives in banishment in the forest with a band of followers, not unlike Robin Hood and his merry men. Rosalind has remained at court with her friend and cousin Celia, Frederick's daughter. Rosalind falls in love with a young man called Orlando, also an exile and also driven from his home by a cruel brother. Their father, now dead, has been a friend of the rightful duke. Frederick is displeased and banishes Rosalind. She disguises herself as a boy, Ganymede, and sets off to find her father in the forest. With her go Celia, posing as the youth's sister, and the jester, Touchstone, who is fond of a country girl called Audrey. In contrast to the false life at court, the forest seems an innocent paradise. Among the beauties of nature, problems disappear. The exiled courtiers muse on their fate and about life in general, particularly melancholy Jaques, who voices pessimistic views about life in and out of the forest. And indeed life is not all roses in the forest. Orlando and his old servant Adam flee there and almost die of hunger and exposure. They meet Rosalind and Celia, and Rosalind, still disguised as a boy, teases Orlando. He must pretend she is the Rosalind of his dreams and practice declaring his love. Shakespeare's audience would have enjoyed an extra comic twist here, watching a boy playing a girl disguised as a boy, asking Orlando to pretend he's a girl. For in Shakespeare's day, of course, boys played all the women's parts, which may be why the playwright so often disguised his heroines as boys. The peace of the forest is disturbed yet again by Oliver, who has followed his brother with murder in mind. When Orlando saves his life, the brothers are reconciled. Oliver falls in love with Celia, and a double wedding is arranged, which becomes a triple and then a quadruple wedding when Touchstone wins Audrey and a lovesick shepherd wins the hand of a poor country girl who has unwittingly fallen for Ganymede. The forest has worked its magic and restored harmony to all. The country setting of As You Like It gives Shakespeare scope to entertain us with poetry and songs of haunting beauty about love and the seasons and the passing of youth. It also lets him poke gentle fun at the sentimental popular songs and poems of his day, which often took the wooing of shepherds and shepherdesses as a theme. There is more talk than action in As You Like It, but the talk is entertaining and thought-provoking. There are serious themes about the nature of life and love. Jaques' wise and poetic speech describing the 7 ages of man is one of the most famous passages in all of Shakespeare's work. It is written pithily in verse, but much of the play is in prose, making conversation sound more normal and easy for the audience to understand, and the characters more lifelike.
As You Like It. It began upon a winter's morning in an orchard in France. A cold sun was slanting down between the naked trees, and a cold wind was making them shiver and shake their skinny fists at an unnatural nature that had stripped them of their clothing when most they had need of it. At the same time, a poorly dressed young man was pacing back and forth, and likewise shaking his fists at an unnatural nature. Against all the obligations of blood, his eldest brother had cheated him out of his rights, and left him to stink in the mire like a beast of the field. "His horses are bred better," he cried out bitterly. "I will no longer endure it." A withered old tree, or so at first glance it seemed, creaked into motion and laid a comforting branch upon the young man's sleeve. It was an aged servant by the name of Adam, who, by his bent back and his pecked and wrinkled cheeks, might have been that very Adam who had been booted out of Eden. Sadly, he shook his frosty head. The lad was right, and it was a bad business. If ever a lad had just cause for complaint, it was Orlando, the youngest son of good Sir Rowland de Boys. Even before the old gentleman had been cold in his grave, Oliver, the eldest son and the new master, had shoved Orlando from his rightful place at table and lorded it over the estate alone. Truly, the world had fallen away from the goodly place it once had been. Suddenly, a shadow fell across the path. "Yonder comes my master, your brother," warned the old man as Oliver, swaggering in furs and velvet, appeared among the trees. As quickly as he could, the old servant took himself off and watched, from a little distance, the meeting of the brothers. The one, a rich and costly gentleman, the other, a rough-hewn peasant in coarse woolen, with anger in his eyes like a half-smothered fire in straw, threatening a sudden blaze. Nor was it long in coming. Angry words passed between them. Then Oliver shouted, "What, boy?" and raised his hand to strike his brother. "Sweet masters, be patient," cried out Adam, rushing forward to prevent murder being done, for Orlando had seized his brother's wrist, twisted his arm behind his back, and secured him with an elbow around his throat, and all in an instant. Already Oliver's face was purple with choking as he kicked and struggled like a dog in a sack. "For your father's remembrance, be at accord," pleaded Adam, but Orlando would not let his brother go until he had squeezed a promise out of him that his inheritance would be paid. "And what wilt thou do? Beg when that is spent?" muttered Oliver savagely, rubbing his bruised throat and his bruised arm. "Leave me." His eye fell upon the old servant. "Get you with him, you old dog." "Is old dog my reward?" protested Adam indignantly. "Most true. I have lost my teeth in your service. God be with my old master. He would not have spoke such a word." Then, seeing Orlando's fists clench in anger at such treatment of a faithful servant, and fearing more violence, he tugged him away. There was someone waiting to speak with Sir Oliver de Boys. A strange visitor indeed. A mountainous fellow who might have broken the back of a bear with his powerful arms, or killed a lion with one blow of his huge fist. He was Monsieur Charles, the Duke's wrestler and the strongest man in France. Despite his great strength, the wrestler was a humble fellow and easily tongue-tied in the presence of a gentleman of rank. "Good, Monsieur Charles," said Oliver pleasantly, and meaning to put the fellow at his ease. "What's the new news at the new court?" "There's no news at the court, sir, but the old news," answered the wrestler, and then, gaining courage, went on to tell that the new Duke was still the new Duke, and his elder brother, whom he had overthrown, had fled for safety into the forest of Arden, and a many merry men with him, he related with growing eloquence. "And there they live like the old Robin Hood of England. They say many young gentlemen flock to him every day, and fleet the time carelessly as they did in the golden world." He paused, and a small sigh crept out of him like a mouse coming forth from a mountain. "You wrestle tomorrow before the new Duke?" inquired Oliver, impatient to bring the fellow out of the golden world and to the purpose of his visit, which he supposed must be to do with his trade. He was not mistaken. At once, a deeply serious look came over Monsieur Charles's large countenance, and Oliver, his heart beating rapidly, listened in silence as the wrestler unburdened his troubled spirit. He had heard that among the foolhardy youth who had put themselves forward to challenge him, there was none other than his lordship's own younger brother, Orlando. It was for this reason that he had come. Earnestly, he begged his lordship to persuade his brother against so foolish a course. He, Charles, had no wish to break the young gentleman's limbs. "I had as lief," murmured Oliver, "thou didst break his neck as his finger." And as Monsieur Charles looked amazed at so unbrotherly a wish, he went on to represent Orlando as so black and treacherous a villain that it would be a good deed to rid the world of him. Monsieur Charles sighed with relief. "I'll give him his payment," he promised. And as the huge fellow departed, well pleased to be doing his lordship a service, Oliver smiled with satisfaction. He hated his brother with all his heart, and for no stronger reason than that Orlando had always been loved better than himself. But it was reason enough. The new court, like a woman in a new gown, was proud but inclined to be uneasy, as if wondering if all was secure behind. This shadow of unease had even darkened the ordinarily high spirits of the two young women who walked together in the great hall of the new Duke's palace. They were princesses both. One was Celia, daughter of Frederick, the new Duke. The other was Rosalind, daughter of his brother, the overthrown Duke in the forest. Although Duke Frederick had protested that he loved Rosalind as tenderly as he loved his own daughter, it was impossible for Rosalind to forget her dearly loved father, living like an outlaw in Arden. "I pray thee, Rosalind," pleaded Celia for the 100th time, "be merry." But neither she nor Touchstone, the court jester, a fellow who, in his own opinion, could have squeezed laughter out of a lemon, could persuade her into more than the mouse of a smile, and a promise that she would try to do better. "Here comes Monsieur le Beau," said Celia. And Rosalind's smile did indeed grow a little as that willowy gentleman of the court wafted towards them, like a flower in velvet boots. "Fair princess," he cried, addressing Celia with a twinkle of yellow stockings and a sweep of his feathered hat, "you have lost much good sport." "Sport?" inquired Celia, upon which the courtier eagerly informed the ladies that Monsieur Charles, the Duke's wrestler, had already broken the ribs of 3 young men who had been rash enough to answer his challenge, and the ladies had missed it. "It is the first time," marvelled Touchstone, "that ever I heard breaking of ribs was sport for ladies." But Monsieur le Beau, ignoring the jester, assured the princesses that they had not missed all. The best was yet to come. Another young man had come forward. Even as he spoke, there was a murmuring commotion, and the Duke and his court flowed into the great hall like a perfumed silken tide. Among them towered the huge figure of Monsieur Charles, and beside him, like a frail sapling next to a mighty oak, walked the new challenger, a humbly dressed youth whose proud looks and straight limbs made the heart ache for the ruin that was to become of them. It was Orlando. Celia heard a sigh that was deep enough to drown a world in. She turned. Her cousin was gazing with enormous eyes at the doomed young man, and her face was pale as death. "Alas," she whispered, "he is too young." Nor was Rosalind the only one to be affected. Duke Frederick himself had sought to persuade the young man from his foolhardy course, but to no avail. "Speak to him, ladies," he urged his daughter and his niece. "See if you can move him." So Orlando was brought before the 2 princesses, who, one after another, begged him to abandon the unequal contest. "Do, young sir," pleaded Rosalind, and with a passion that seemed to Celia to have been stirred by something stronger than a mere wish to please the Duke. But the young man was resolved. He declared it did not matter to him whether he lived or died, although his eyes, as he gazed at Rosalind, seemed to the curious Celia to tell a very different tale. "The little strength that I have, I would it were with you," breathed Rosalind, as the young man bowed to the 2 princesses and departed to do battle with the cruel giant. Rosalind could not bear to watch. She covered her face with her hands, but at the same time could not bear not to watch, and her eyes kept sparkling through a lattice-work of fingers. "You shall try but one fall," she heard the Duke command, and she glimpsed the wide, seated circle of the eager court. "But come your ways," the young man shouted defiantly, and the contest began. She shut her eyes. She could hear grunts and gasps and cries, and the scrape and thump of staggering feet. She opened her eyes, caught a sudden sight of the giant's face, swollen with fierce triumph. Then the young man, his poor head in a halter of mighty arms. The Duke was leaning forward, his fists were tightly clenched. A lady of the court had fainted clean away, a gentleman was sprinkling her with water, and a lady by her side was frantically tugging to free her gown. There was a loud cry. Then came a great shout. The Duke was on his feet, amazed. Fearfully, Rosalind took her hands away from her face. She stared. "Oh, excellent young man," she cried out. Most marvellously, he was standing upright and unharmed. Beside him, like a fallen mountain, lay Monsieur Charles. The contest was ended. The youth had overthrown the giant. Everyone was on their feet and applauding, and while 6 servants carried the groaning Charles away, the Duke himself, all smiles, was shaking the young man by the hand and asking his name. "Orlando, my liege," he answered proudly, "the youngest son of Sir Rowland de Boys." At once, the Duke let go his hand. Sir Rowland de Boys had been the good friend of the Duke in the forest, Therefore his son was the new Duke's enemy. In an instant, smiles were changed to frowns, and joy to darkness and anger. "I would thou hadst told me of another father," he said abruptly, and departed from the hall, with the suddenly alarmed court hastening after. Orlando and the two princesses were alone in the great hall, with some awkward yards of silence between them. "Let us go thank him," said Celia, feeling that if she did not speak, her cousin and the young man would remain motionless like two posts in a field for ever and a day. Gently but firmly she urged Rosalind forward. "Gentlemen," murmured Rosalind, "wear this for me," and impulsively taking a gold chain from her neck, offered it to Orlando. He stared at it. Impatiently, Rosalind put it over his head, and then, overcome with confusion at her own boldness, she turned to Celia. "Shall we go, coz?" "Aye." "Fare you well, fair gentleman," said Celia with a smile, and took her cousin by the arm. They were halfway to vanishing from the hall before Orlando recovered the power of speech. "Can I not say I thank you?" he whispered, marvelling at the suddenness of the affliction that had struck him dumb. "He calls us back!" cried Rosalind, catching the whisper and dragging Celia nearly off her feet in her haste to return. "Did you call, sir?" she asked eagerly, but Orlando was speechless again. "Sir, you have wrestled well, and overthrown more than your enemies," she went on, with such warmth in her voice and honesty in her eyes that a stone would have been moved to speak. But not Orlando. "Will you go, coz?" murmured Celia, seeing it was a hopeless case. Reluctantly Rosalind agreed, and with a sad shake of her head accompanied her cousin out of the hall. Helplessly the young man gazed after her. "Oh, poor Orlando," he sighed, "thou art overthrown." The god of love had shot him, not with a single arrow, but with his whole quiver full. But the god of hate was also aiming his arrows at Orlando. He felt a touch upon his shoulder. Startled, he turned. Monsieur Le Beau, on his velvet feet, had tiptoed up beside him. "Good sir," muttered the courtier, with anxious looks behind, "I do in friendship counsel you to leave this place." Orlando frowned in puzzlement, and the courtier went on to confide that the Duke, who trusted no one, had suddenly taken it into his head that the youngest son of Sir Rowland de Boys was a threat to him. "Sir, fare you well," he urged, and as he spoke, the mask of smiles that he, like everyone else in the new Duke's court, habitually wore, slipped to reveal an honest man with an honest care for the young man's safety. "Hereafter, in a better world than this," he murmured softly, "I shall desire more love and knowledge of you." Orlando thanked him warmly, and cursing the cruelty of fortune that had offered him love with one hand only to snatch it back with the other, he hastened away. Sadly, Monsieur Le Beau watched him go. Then, adjusting his courtier's mask of smiles, he trotted off to wait upon his master. The Duke was in a fever of enemies. He saw them all around him. Every smile hid a frown, every word of love hid a thought of hate. No one was beyond suspicion, and least of all Rosalind, the daughter of the brother he had wronged, and whose presence in the court he had only tolerated on account of the love his own daughter had for her. But that was all over. "Mistress," he shouted, bursting into the apartment where his daughter and the hated one were laughing together, "get you from our court." "Me, uncle?" cried Rosalind, amazed. "You," answered the Duke in a mounting rage, and he swore that if she should be found within 20 miles of the court, she would die for it. Celia, outraged by her father's cruel injustice, declared that she would go wherever her cousin went. "You are a fool," said the Duke contemptuously, and with his palely smiling courtiers swept out of the room. The cousins stared at one another in fear and stark amazement. "Whither shall we go?" whispered Rosalind at length. "To seek my uncle in the forest of Arden," decided Celia without hesitation. The forest! At once, the image of a dark and dreadful place of savage beasts and lurking robbers presented itself to the cousin's imagination. Surely it was no place for a pair of tender princesses. "I'll put myself in poor and mean attire," proposed Celia. "The like do you." "Were it not better," suggested Rosalind, "because I am more than common tall, that I do suit me all points like a man?" So it was agreed. Rosalind, in man's attire, would be known as Ganymede, and Celia, dressed like a shepherdess, would be his sister Aliena. Then Rosalind had another thought. Should they not take Touchstone, the court jester, with them for company? Celia nodded. "He'll go along o'er the wide world with me," she promised. and straightway the cousins set about making ready for their flight. While the two princesses, in secret haste, were stuffing their purses with gold and their satchels with clothing, and Touchstone, gnawing his fingernails, was waiting below their window to steady the ladder for their nighttime descent, Orlando, that other victim of the Duke's frantic suspicions, returned to his lodging. As he approached, all was dark. A shadow stirred. "Who's there?" It was old Adam, his face as white as his hair. "O unhappy youth, come not within these doors," he cried out, barring Orlando's path. In a shaking voice, he warned the young man that his brother Oliver, enraged by his success, meant to burn down his lodging that very night, with the sleeping Orlando inside it. "This house is but a butchery," he whispered. "Do not enter it." Orlando, his life now threatened in his own home, asked bitterly what was to become of him. Must he get his living by robbing on the highway or by begging in the town? The old servant shook his head. He had 500 crowns, he said, that he had saved up during his long years of service, and now at last he had found a better use for his little fortune than ever he could have supposed. He offered it to Orlando, and asked no more in return than that the young man should take him as his servant. "Though I look old, yet I am strong and lusty," he protested, as Orlando looked sadly at his white hair and frail limbs. "Let me go with you. I'll do the service of a younger man." "Oh, good old man," cried Orlando, his eyes filling up with tears. "Thou art not for the fashion of these times, where none will sweat but for promotion." Adam bowed his head. "But come thy ways," said Orlando with a smile. "We'll go along together." And with lifting hearts and sturdy pace, they set off side by side into the night. The palace was in an uproar. The princesses had gone, and the jester with them. Their beds had been unslept in, and none knew when nor where they had fled. All that could be found out was from a gentlewoman who had overheard the princesses warmly praising the youth who had overthrown the wrestler. "Find that youth," was her shrewd advice, "and you will find the others." "Fetch that gallant hither," commanded the Duke. "If he be absent, bring his brother." And as frightened courtiers hastened to obey, the search went on, high and low, for the runaways. The day was ending, and in the forest the gathering gloom turned every tree into a lurking robber and every bush into a bear. "Oh, Jupiter, how merry are my spirits!" cried Rosalind, for all the world as if she meant it, but her companions were not of her mind. "I care not for my spirits if my legs were not weary," groaned Touchstone, his melancholy countenance drooping onto the bright patchwork of his jester's coat, and Celia, a princess of burrs and scratches, limping far behind, wailed, "I pray you bear with me, I can go no further." "Well, this is the Forest of Arden," said Rosalind, determined to be cheerful, for now she was in man's attire, with her golden hair crammed up inside her feathered cap. She was resolved, against all private inclination, to be a prop and a comfort to her frailer friends. "Aye, now I am in Arden," moaned Touchstone, sitting down on a tree stump and nursing his blistered feet. "A more fool I. When I was at home I was in a better place." There came a sound of footfalls and a murmur of voices. The three travellers looked to one another in alarm, and then, forgetful of their aching limbs, skipped, brisk as lambs, into the concealment of the trees. No sooner had they vanished from the clearing than two inhabitants of the forest appeared. They proved to be nothing more alarming than a pair of shepherds, one sturdy and grey-haired, the other young and tender and full of sighs. They were talking of love, and the elder was gently advising his young companion against being too slavish in his courtship of his beloved. But his words went unheeded. "Oh, Corin," cried the afflicted one, clapping a hand to his pale brow, "that thou knewst how I do love her." "I partly guess," smiled Corin, "for I have loved her now." But the youth would not have it. He could not believe that any man had loved as he loved, and not bear the scars for all to see. "Thou hast not loved," he cried indignantly, and clutching his hair as if to pull it out by the roots, rushed off into the forest calling, "Oh, Phoebe, Phoebe, Phoebe," to the unfeeling bushes and trees. Rosalind, in concealment, felt an ache in her heart. The shepherd's passion for his Phoebe reminded her sharply of her own for Orlando, and such was the power of visible love that even the ever-mocking Touchstone was driven to recollect a time when he, too, had been laid low by the same madness. "We that are true lovers," he sighed, "run into strange capers." Celia alone felt differently. True, she felt pangs, but they were in her stomach, not in her heart. "I pray you," she begged, "one of you question yond man. If he for gold will give us any food, I faint almost to death." "Holla, you clown!" called out Touchstone, with a courtier's contempt for simple countrymen, who were little better than the beasts they tended. "Who calls?" asked Corin, and he stared in wonderment as the trees disgorged themselves of strange fruit indeed. A haughty jester, a lady dressed as a shepherdess, who, he would have taken his oath, had never tended sheep save with a knife and spoon as mutton, and a swaggering young huntsman with villainous sword and fearsome spear, whose complexion was as soft as a flower. "Good even to you, friend," said the huntsman, with a mildness that belied his fierce ironmongery, and he went on to beg, for his fainting sister's sake, food and shelter, for which he was willing to pay. Sadly, Corin shook his head. He was not his own master, but served a man who cared nothing for hospitality, and wanted only to sell his cottage, pasture and flock, and have done with them. On hearing this, the young huntsman glanced at his sister, and she, poor famished soul, eagerly nodded her head. Without more ado, the huntsman offered to buy the property, and paid Corin his wages for tending the sheep. "Assuredly the thing is to be sold," said Corin, well pleased at the prospect of so pleasant and moneyed a young master, and they all went off together, new landlords of a piece of Arden. But in another part of the forest, two travellers were not so fortunate. They had journeyed far, and one, the elder, was almost at his end. "Dear master, I can go no further," gasped old Adam, his piled-up years at last overcoming his willing spirit. "Oh, I die for food. Here lie I down," he sighed, sinking to the ground, "and measure out my grave. Farewell, kind master." "Why, how now, Adam?" cried Orlando, rushing back to help the old man. "No greater heart in thee?" Desperately he chafed the old man's freezing hands and smoothed his brow. He gathered moss and leaves to make a pillow for his bed, and laid his coat over the old man to keep him warm. "Live a little, comfort a little," he pleaded, and hoping that the habit of long service would make the old servant obey, he sternly bade him keep death away while he, Orlando, went in search of food. "Thou shalt not die for lack of a dinner," he promised, and drawing his sword, set off into the forest. "Cheerly, good Adam," he called back encouragingly, but could not subdue the dread in his heart that when he returned, old Adam would no longer be alive. As he crept among the darkening trees, he paused from time to listen for a rustling or the crackling of a twig that would betray some wild creature that would serve them for food. But the forest was as quiet as a grave. Then, suddenly, he heard very faintly a strange sound. He strained his ears. It was a voice singing. With beating heart, he hastened towards it. "Under the greenwood tree, who loves to lie with me." It was a young man's voice, full of easy confidence, and seemed to be moving from place to place. Eagerly Orlando followed it, sometimes mistaking the echo for the substance, but ever drawing nearer. "Come hither, come hither, come hither," tempted the wandering voice. "Here shall he see no enemy, but winter and rough weather. Come hither, come hither." Stumbling over roots, scratched and torn by spiteful branches, Orlando pursued the song. Suddenly it ceased. Lanterns were gleaming among the trees, and there was a murmur of voices. Orlando stopped amazed. In a golden clearing, like a little summer's day, a company of outlaws were gathered together, and in their midst was spread enough good things to eat to save a dozen dying men. With a wildly desperate cry, Orlando rushed into the clearing, fiercely brandishing his sword. "Forbear, and eat no more." The outlaws turned in astonishment. "Why, I have eaten none yet," protested one, a long-faced, melancholy fellow, pointing to his empty plate. Then another, who from the respect accorded him seemed to be the leader of the band, reproached Orlando for his show of needless force. "What would you have?" he asked courteously. "I almost die for food," answered Orlando, to which the other replied, "Sit down and feed, and welcome to our table." Strange forest, where fury was answered with gentleness, and outlaws spoke with the tongues of kindness. Ashamed, Orlando laid his sword aside. "There is an old, poor man," he told them, "who after me hath many a weary step limped in pure love. Till he be first sufficed, I will not touch a bit." "Go find him out," said the leader kindly, "and we will nothing waste till you return." "I thank ye," cried Orlando, weeping with gratitude, and hastened back to his old servant, praying with all his heart that he would not be too late. "Thou seest we are not all alone unhappy," observed the Duke when the wild young man had gone, for this leader of the outlaw band was indeed the banished Duke, and the outlaws gathered round him were the young men who had flocked to join him and live the greenwood life. "This wide and universal theatre," continued the philosophical Duke, "presents more woeful pageants than the scene wherein we play in." "All the world's a stage," instantly observed the melancholy one, whose name was Jaques, "and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts, his acts being 7 ages. He paused, and picking up his empty plate, polished it on his sleeve till it shone like a mirror, and studied his reflection. Then, suiting his expression to his words, he expounded the 7 ages of man, from the infant, mewling and puking in the nurse's arms, and continuing on his relentless journey to the grave, concluding with second childishness and mere oblivion. Sans teeth, sans eyes, sans taste, sans everything. But no sooner had his bleak and dreadful vision of man's old age been presented, than in an instant it was overthrown. Orlando returned, bearing old Adam on his back. The good old man had obeyed his young master and remained alive. Here was the visible evidence of age not useless, but wonderfully enriched by courage, loyalty, and love. "Welcome," cried the Duke, mightily glad to see it. "Set down your venerable burden and let him feed." At once, willing hands assisted the old man to a place at the feast and helped him to food. And while his guests were satisfying their hunger, the Duke called for music, and the singer, who had been heard in the forest, obliged the company with another song. "Blow, blow, thou winter wind, thou art not so unkind as man's ingratitude," he sang, while the courtiers in the forest sighed and nodded. It was a truth they had learned only too well. "Then hey-ho the holly, this life is most jolly." And all were agreed. Even as Orlando found gentleness in the savage forest, so his brother Oliver found savagery in the gentle court. The maddened Duke Frederick, still seeking his daughter, had learned that Orlando had also fled. "Find out thy brother," he shouted at the fearful Oliver. "Bring him dead or living within this 12-month." And with bloodshot eye and direst threats, dispatched him to obey or lose all that he possessed. So Oliver, like many another bewildered by sudden adversity, turned his desperate steps towards the forest of Arden. A strange malady had begun to afflict the trees of the forest. It first appeared as Touchstone and the good countryman Corin were walking together, near to the cottage that Celia and Rosalind had newly bought. "Here comes young Master Ganymede," said Corin, interrupting the jester's unending flow of wit, as Rosalind, still in her man's attire, came winding slowly among the trees. She was deep in the study of a paper, and, unaware of her audience, was reading aloud. "From the east to western Ind, no jewel is like Rosalind." "This is the very false gallop of verses," cried Touchstone, unable to endure such poor stuff. "Why do you infect yourself with them?" "Peace, you dull fool," cried Rosalind, blushing to have been overheard reciting her own praises. "I found them on a tree." "Truly, the tree yields bad fruit," said the jester, to which Rosalind returned as good as she got, and the battle of wits would have continued had not another deep reader appeared among the trees. It was Celia, likewise with her nose in a paper that declared still more wonders of Rosalind. "Oh, most gentle Jupiter," protested Rosalind, when it was plain there was no more to come, "what tedious homily of love!" Startled, Celia turned to discover an audience crowding at her heels. She was no better pleased than Rosalind at being overheard reciting not her own praises but another's. Sharply she dismissed the jester and the countryman. Then she turned to Rosalind and held out the paper. "Didst thou hear these verses?" Humbly Rosalind confessed she had, but hastened to add that she did not think highly of them. Celia gazed at her cousin thoughtfully, and asked if she had not wondered how it had come about that half the trees in the forest had been stricken by the same poetic malady. Again Rosalind confessed it, and held out her own paper in evidence. Celia ignored it, and inquired if Rosalind knew who had hung up her name so far and wide. "Is it a man?" ventured Rosalind, striving to keep a mounting excitement out of her voice. Celia nodded. "And a chain," she said, striving to keep a bubbling up of laughter out of hers, "that you once wore about his neck. Change you colour?" a needless question. At once, Rosalind began to plague Celia for more particulars, which Celia laughingly withheld like sweets from a child, until, having been pursued round trees and bushes by her wildly importuning cousin, she gave up and confessed that the poet had been none other than the young man who had wrestled so well, Orlando. But far from contenting her, the news drove Rosalind at first into a frantic dismay that Orlando should see her in man's attire and not at her best, and then into another tempest of questioning that was only stopped when Celia cried, "Soft! Comes he not here?" Rosalind's eyes grew huge. "'Tis he," she whispered, and jerked Celia into concealment as her beloved approached. He was not alone. He was walking with a long-faced, melancholy fellow, a wretch who was daring to complain that Orlando's love songs were spoiling the trees. But Orlando defended his verses with spirit. "Rosalind is your love's name?" the wretch inquired, and on receiving confirmation most impertinently declared, "I do not like her name." To which Orlando justly replied, "There was no thought of pleasing you when she was christened." The fellow sniffed and asked, "What stature is she of?" "Just as high as my heart," came back the answer, which in Rosalind's opinion could not have been bettered by any man. At length they parted with expressions of mutual disdain, and Orlando was left alone. "I will speak to him like a saucy lackey," determined Rosalind, and before Celia could stop her, she had strutted out with a swagger and a manly frown. Uneasily Celia followed. She could not believe the young man would fail to recognise his Rosalind, no matter what she wore. But love proved blind, not only to the loved one's faults, but to her virtues as well. True, once or twice he looked curiously at Master Ganymede, as if a recollection was stirring. But it was plain he never saw, in the impudently posturing youth before him, the gently bred princess of the court. "I pray you, what is 'o'clock?" she began. And thereafter Celia was lost in wonderment as she found herself audience to the strangest courtship in the world. Lacking the assistance of a gorgeous gown, rich golden hair and speaking eyes, Rosalind had only her wit with which to dazzle her lover, to entangle and bewitch him with 1,000 whirling words. "Love is merely a madness," she was saying, having at last, like a skilful shepherd, guided her unruly flock of words to that very subject. "Yet I profess curing it by counsel." "I would not be cured, youth," sighed Orlando, upon which Rosalind, concealing her joy, insisted that her remedy at least be tried. Then, sailing so near to the wind of discovery that Celia held her breath, she proposed that Orlando call her Rosalind and come to court her every day, when she would be so wild, so fantastical, so changeable and contrary in her moods, that the very name of Rosalind would become a torment rather than a delight. "And this way I will take it upon me," she promised, "to wash your liver as clean as a sound sheep's heart, that there shall not be one spot of love in't." Orlando smiled at the youth's confidence, but assured him that the remedy would have no success. But Rosalind insisted, and Orlando, with a laugh, gave in. "With all my heart, good youth." "Nay," cried Rosalind, raising her hand in stern rebuke, "you must call me Rosalind," and extending a brotherly arm to Celia, stalked away before solemnity was blown to the winds. Love lay on the forest like a blight. The very trees, as if they had sucked in sugar from the verses that had been hung upon them, seemed to twine together in gnarly embraces, and Jaques, who had just parted from one lovesick fool, now found himself witness to a pair of them like cock and hen crowing in a glade. One was a fool by nature, the other a fool by profession. Touchstone, wearied of country life and finding nothing to aim his wit at, save a few sagely nodding bushes and a philosophical sheep or two, had decided to take unto himself a wife. It seemed to be in the fashion, and he was nothing if not fashionable. He had chosen for this high office one Audrey, a country wench, thick of speech and stinking like a goat. The union suited him very well. As male and female they agreed as readily as the beasts of the field, and as courtier and foul slut they were worlds apart. In this manner he found satisfaction both as a man and as a gentleman, for Audrey never understood a word he said, and accordingly held him in high respect. But yet there were moments when he could not help having his doubts. Truly, he sighed, gazing at Audrey, whose mouth stood open like a kitchen door, blasting forth stale cabbage and onions, I would the gods had made thee poetical. I do not know what poetical is, pleaded Audrey, humbled by the wondrous mystery of language. Is it honest in deed and word? Is it a true thing? No, truly, for the truest poetry is the most feigning, returned Touchstone. Then, perceiving that his pearls had been cast away, sadly shook his head. But be it as it may be, he sighed, having weighed Audrey against a lonely life which was something against nothing. I will marry thee. And Audrey laughed and clapped her hands. Well, the gods give us joy, she cried. Orlando had not come. The morning sun, bursting through the forest in misty beams and sudden glares, made 1,000 flickering phantoms of him, but none proved real, and Rosalind, disgracing her man's attire, wept. Celia, who knew nothing of the pangs of true love, tried to comfort her cousin by abusing Orlando for lack of constancy. Nay, certainly there is no truth in him, she declared. Not true in love? Wailed Rosalind. Yes, when he is in, said Celia, but I think he is not in. But you heard him swear downright he was. Was is not is, pointed out Celia, and would have said a great deal more had not their shepherd, old Corin, interrupted the argument. He came in haste, his weathered face all aglow. With twinkling merriment, he told his mistress and his master of an entertainment nearby in the forest that was well worth their attendance. The young shepherd, who, as they remembered, was so in love that he was almost dying of it, was even now pleading his cause before his Phoebe. Go hence a little, he urged, and I shall conduct you. Oh, come, cried Rosalind eagerly, the sight of lovers feedeth those in love, and the cousins followed after the beckoning old countryman. The lovers were in a clearing, like a tragical picture framed in tangled hawthorn and sharp briar. The young shepherd, whose name was Silvius, was on his knees before his Phoebe, who sat on a tree stump, a rustic queen upon a rustic throne. Sweet Phoebe, do not scorn me, he pleaded, while she, proud, impossible she, her black eyes sparkling like coals in a grate, dealt him blow after blow of sovereign disdain. At length, Rosalind could endure her unkindness and arrogance no longer. Who might be your mother, she cried, striding into the clearing and confronting the lofty shepherdess, that you insult, exalt, and all at once over the wretched? The wretched fell over backwards, and the rustic queen gaped in amazement at the sudden youth, whose eyes outflashed her own. Quite dazzled, she sat in silence as he indignantly rebuked her for her pride. Nor was Silvius spared. You foolish shepherd, the youth declared, more in pity than in anger. Wherefore do you follow her like foggy south puffing with wind and rain? You are 1,000 times a properer man than she a woman. 'Tis such fools as you that make the world full of ill-favoured children. 'Tis not her glass, but you that flatters her. Then he turned again on Phoebe, and, pointing an accusing finger, cried, But, mistress, know yourself. Down on your knees, and thank heaven fasting for a good man's love. For I must tell you, friendly in your ear, he beckoned, and she most willingly left her throne and inclined her head to the youth's red lips as he softly advised, Sell when you can. You are not for all markets. Cry the man mercy. Love him. Take his offer. Then, with a last injunction of Silvius to take his Phoebe to himself, the youth and his 2 companions departed from the glade. Long after the youth had gone, Phoebe sat gazing after him. No youth had ever spoken to her so sternly before, and she was full of bewilderment and sighs. She looked at Silvius, who loved her dearly, and she sighed again. Then she thought of the youth, and her sighs came fast as a blacksmith's bellows. I write to him a very taunting letter, she said thoughtfully, and thou shalt bear it. Wilt thou, Silvius? She asked, with such a smile at her lover that he, feeling he had been paid in better than gold, could deny her nothing. I will be bitter with him, she said, and Silvius believed her. Marching through the forest with a festive spring of holly in his cap, and whistling an air that was all the fashion with the banished duke and his companions, Orlando came at last to where the youth and his sister dwelt. Good day and happiness, dear Rosalind, he announced to his pretended love, with a flourish of his cap and a gallant bow, only to be greeted by a frown, severely folded arms, and a tapping of the foot. He was late. "My fair Rosalind," he protested in answer to her reproaches, "I come within an hour of my promise." "Break an hour's promise in love," cried she. And he, contrite as a crocodile, hung his head and pleaded, "Pardon me, dear Rosalind." She thought about it and pardoned him. She was no more able to keep sullen than a child could keep still in church. "Come, woo me," she commanded, with a royal clap of her hands, "for now I am in a holiday humour, and like enough to consent." And so once again Celia found herself witness to this strangest of strange courtships, in which pretended love hid honest love, and false words were true. "Am I not your Rosalind?" demanded Rosalind, and Orlando, with a wishful smile, answered, "I take some joy to say you are." Then Rosalind, true to her promise of being contrary, said she would not have him, and he, true to his lover's part, swore it would kill him. But this was too much for Rosalind's good sense. "Men have died from time to time," she said, "and worms have eaten them, but not for love." He frowned. "I would not have my right Rosalind of this mind," he said, and instantly she changed about. She would indeed have him. "And 20 such," she added, for good measure. "What sayest thou?" he cried, outraged. She gazed at him with wide, innocent eyes. "Are you not good?" she asked. He said he hoped he was. "Why then," she declared triumphantly, "can one desire too much of a good thing?" She laughed and turned to Celia. "Come, sister, you shall be the priest and marry us." Celia stared. Truly this strange courtship had passed beyond all bounds. "I cannot say the words," she muttered uneasily. "You must begin," instructed Rosalind. "Will you, Orlando?" Celia sighed, and shrugging her shoulders married off the false, yet true, couple who stood hand in hand before her, feeling all the while that a high solemnity was being mocked. "Now tell me," demanded Rosalind of Orlando after the ceremony was concluded, "how long you would have her after you have possessed her?" "Forever and a day," he answered very properly, but she shook her head. "Say a day without the ever," she advised. "No, Orlando. Men are April when they woo, December when they wed. Maids are May when they are maids, but the sky changes when they are wives." But Orlando would not believe his Rosalind would ever change, and he put a stop to all arguments that proved the contrary, by remembering that he was to wait upon the Duke at dinner. "For these 2 hours, Rosalind, I will leave thee." "Alas, dear love," she cried, clutching him fiercely by the sleeve, "I cannot lack thee 2 hours." But there was no help for it, so after threatening him with her direst displeasure if he should be so much as a minute late in returning, she let him go. Celia was bursting with indignation over her cousin's outrageous display of female perversity. "You have simply misused our sex in your love-prate," she cried. "We must have your doublet and hose plucked over your head, and show the world what the bird hath done to her own nest." But Rosalind did not care. "Oh, coz," she laughed, flinging out her arms and dancing on the green. "My pretty little coz, that thou didst know how many fathom deep I am in love." Then, remembering that 2 long hours must pass, she said, "I'll go find a shadow and sigh till he come." "And I'll sleep," said Celia, who was not in love. The 2 hours came and went, but brought no Orlando. Instead, they wafted another lover through the forest, the breathless Silvius doing his Phoebe's bidding. He had brought her letter and faithfully delivered it into Master Ganymede's hand, with humble apologies for the bitter and taunting words that Phoebe said she had written. Impatiently, and with many an anxious glance for the coming of Orlando, Rosalind read the letter. Her brow grew dark with anger, and Silvius trembled that his Phoebe should have written so cruelly. Rosalind looked up. "Will you hear the letter?" she asked. "So please you," answered Silvius, so she read it to him. As he listened, his eyes grew big with tears. Phoebe had deceived him. The words she had written were bitter, but only to him. The letter he had carried was full of a wild and tender passion, but not for him. She had fallen in love with Ganymede. "Alas, poor shepherd," sighed Celia, but Rosalind felt no pity for the foolish youth who was weeping for so worthless a creature as Phoebe. "Well, go your way to her, for I see love hath made thee a tame snake," she cried, angry that love, which should have ennobled, had reduced this lover to so crawling a condition. "Say this to her: if she love me, I charge her to love thee. If she will not, I will never have her. She stopped. She had glimpsed a familiar figure approaching through the trees. Hastily she dismissed Silvius and made herself ready for... But once again it was not Orlando. Yet there had been something about the stranger that had, for a moment, deceived her. He was handsome enough, but no Orlando, and his manner was gentle, though inclined to be awkward, like a new garment not yet worn in. He was looking for a cottage near a clump of olive trees where a brother and sister dwelt together. As he spoke, he looked curiously at Rosalind and Celia, and wondered if they could be the pair who owned the cottage. "It is no boast, being asked, to say we are," answered Celia, and a sudden summer of roses bloomed in her cheeks as she met the stranger's inquiring gaze. Nor was the stranger unaffected. He seemed for a moment to forget the purpose of his errand. He faltered, looked confused, then recovering himself, began, "Orlando doth commend him to you both," and at once Rosalind understood why he had reminded her of her love. He had come from Orlando, and therefore bore his imprint. "And to the youth he calls his Rosalind," the stranger continued, "he sends this bloody napkin." He held out a handkerchief streaked with red. Rosalind stared at it. "What must we understand by this?" she whispered, suddenly pale. The stranger sighed. Then, seating himself cross-legged on the turf with his audience like eager children kneeling before him, he told a story so strange, so wild and wonderful, that the cousins scarcely dared to breathe. It began with Orlando on his way to keep his promise to his imagined Rosalind. As he walked through the forest full of dreams, he came upon a ragged man, asleep under an ancient tree. About the sleeper's neck, like a lady's bright scarf, was coiled a deadly serpent, which on hearing Orlando's approach glided harmlessly away. But a more terrible danger was near at hand. Under a bush crouched a hungry lioness, waiting to leap upon the sleeper with savage teeth and claws. Orlando drew close, then stopped in amazement. He recognized the man. It was his brother, his elder brother, Oliver. "Oh, I have heard him speak of that same brother," breathed Celia, staring at the stranger as if wondering how he could know so much without having been present himself. "And he did render him the most unnatural that lived amongst men." "But to Orlando," cried Rosalind, impatient of brothers and all else, save Orlando. "Did he leave him there?" The stranger shook his head. Though sorely tempted to leave his brother to the lioness, and so be revenged for all the ill usage he had suffered, he could not do so. As the lioness roared and sprang, Orlando, without a thought for his own danger, met her in mid-career. They wrestled, and in a moment he had overthrown the savage beast as readily as he had once overthrown the mighty Charles. Here the stranger paused, and then said quietly, "In which, hurtling from miserable slumber, I awaked." He himself had been that sleeping man. He was Oliver, Orlando's wicked brother. The cousins stared at him, Rosalind with anger, but Celia more with sorrow that so fair a young man should turn out to be so black a villain. But no longer. With earnest looks, he told them of his most wonderful conversion, of how, having been dispatched by the tyrant duke to bring back Orlando, he had wandered in the forest, becoming more and more wretched until the moment he had awakened from sleep to see Orlando endangering his own life to save his brother's. At once, all envy and malice had vanished from his heart, and now there was only love and forgiveness between himself and Orlando. Celia listened with shining eyes, but Rosalind was still troubled. She had not forgotten the strange token that Orlando had sent. "But for the bloody napkin?" she asked, and Oliver resumed his story. Orlando had taken him to the banished duke, where he had been received with great kindness and given fresh clothing. But as Orlando himself was changing his torn attire, he suddenly fainted. The lioness had ripped open his arm, and he had lost much blood. But he quickly recovered, and begged Oliver to seek out the brother and sister in the forest, to explain to them the reason for his failure to keep his promise. "And," concluded Oliver with a smile, "to give this napkin dyed in his blood, and to the shepherd youth that he in sport doth call his Rosalind." He rose, and courteously presented Orlando's crimson gift. "Why, how now, Ganymede? Sweet Ganymede!" cried out Celia in a fright, for Rosalind, seeing Orlando's blood, had fainted clean away. "Many will swoon when they do look on blood," said Oliver, but Celia, vigorously chafing her cousin's cold hands, shook her head. "There is more in it," she muttered. "Cousin, Ganymede." Rosalind opened her eyes. "I would I were at home," she murmured, and suffered herself to be helped to her feet. Then, fearful that her sudden weakness had betrayed her sex, she assured Oliver that her fainting had been pretence, that she had not fainted at all, that she had never felt better, and that he was to be sure to tell his brother how skilfully she had pretended. She looked to see how well her assurances had been received, and could not help noting some resemblances to Orlando in his elder brother's features, but they were prentice work compared with what nature had accomplished when she tried again. Celia, on the other hand, as she and Oliver assisted Rosalind back to their cottage, could not help wondering, as she kept glancing at the young man, if nature, like a lucky player, had not done her best at the first throw. "Good sir," she murmured as he showed signs of departing, "go with us." "We shall find a time, Audrey," sighed Touchstone as the sun went down among the trees, and marriage, like Monday after Sunday, threatened ahead. "Patience, gentle Audrey," he urged, as gazing at his chosen bride ambling foolishly among her goats, he wondered yet again about the wisdom of his choice. But even as he puzzled over it, and would have given much to find some means of delay, there was another in the forest ready to give up all to hasten it. "My father's house, and all the revenue that was old Sir Rowland's, will lay estate upon you," cried Oliver distractedly, as he dragged Orlando back to the cottage where Ganymede and his sister Aliena dwelt. He had fallen in love with Aliena, and she with him. It had happened in an instant, in the merest twinkling of eyes, and now all he desired was to marry Aliena, poor as she was, and live and die by her side, a humble shepherd in the forest. Orlando marvelled at the swiftness of it all, although why he, who had been struck dumb with love for Rosalind with a suddenness that made his brother's courtship seem almost tedious, should be surprised was a mystery. Nonetheless, he would not stand in their way, and promised to bring the banished Duke and all his followers to celebrate their forest wedding on the morrow. "Go you and prepare Aliena," he advised, "for look you, here comes my Rosalind." Warmly, Oliver clasped his brother by the uninjured hand. Then, greeting the approaching Ganymede as "fair sister," he laughed and hastened to Aliena's cottage. "Oh, my dear Orlando," cried Rosalind, regarding his bandages with concern, "how it grieves me to see thee wear thy heart in a scarf." "It is my arm," he protested. She expressed surprise, then inquired if, by any chance, his brother had told him how well she had pretended to faint on seeing his blood. "Aye," nodded Orlando, "and greater wonders than that," he said, with a smiling look towards the departed Oliver. She took his meaning, and at once confirmed that Aliena's passion was fully the equal of his brother's. "They are in the very wrath of love," she declared. "They will together. Clubs cannot part them." "They shall be married tomorrow," Orlando promised. Then he sighed. "But oh, how bitter a thing it is to look into happiness through another man's eyes." "Why then tomorrow?" asked Rosalind softly. "I cannot serve your turn for Rosalind?" "I can no longer live by thinking," said he. "I will weary you then no longer with idle talking," said she, much moved by the honesty of Orlando's love and the deepness of his distress. The time was near for truth. Her own heart could scarcely hold out against it, but it must be revealed with proper solemnity and mystery. "Believe then, if you please, I can do strange things," she told her lover gravely. "I have, since I was 3-year-old, conversed with a magician." He smiled, but she reproved him with a frown and continued, "If you do love Rosalind so near the heart as your gesture cries it out, when your brother marries Aliena, shall you marry her?" Orlando stared. "Speakest thou in sober meanings?" he demanded. "By my life I do," returned she. "If you will be married tomorrow, you shall. And to Rosalind, if you will." He would have pressed further, but there were others in the forest who had come to seek out Ganymede. Phoebe, the vain and foolish shepherdess, her black eyes screwed up in anger like rivets in a plank, and with her poor love following after, had come to reproach that youth for reading aloud her very private letter. "You have done me much ungentleness," she complained. "I care not if I have," answered Rosalind, wearied by such persistence in folly. "You are there followed by a faithful shepherd. Look upon him, love him, he worships you." But Phoebe shook her silly head. "Tell this youth," she bade the doting Silvius, "what 'tis to love." "It is to be all made of sighs and tears," responded Silvius hopelessly. "And so am I for Phoebe." "And I for Ganymede," echoed Phoebe with a yearning look. "And I for Rosalind," sighed Orlando, adding his link to the chain. Then all turned to Ganymede, who smiled, and ended the chain most mysteriously with, "And I for no woman." Then mystery upon mystery, The strange youth raised a hand and solemnly commanded, "Tomorrow meet me all together," then spoke to each in turn, first to Phoebe. "I will marry you if ever I marry woman, and I'll be married tomorrow." Then to Orlando, "I will satisfy you if ever I satisfied man, and you shall be married tomorrow." And last to Silvius, "I will content you if what pleases you contents you, and you shall be married tomorrow." Then, making a magical sign in the air, doubtless learned from the magician, the youth vanished among the trees, leaving the three lovers to stare and wonder, to hope and doubt if these marvels could ever be brought to pass. 2 little pages from the banished Duke's court, all in green like leaves of holly, with faces bright as berries, came marching through the dawning forest, singing as they went. It was a lover and his lass, with a hey and a ho and a hey nonny no, that o'er the green cornfield did pass. In springtime, the only pretty ring time, when birds do sing, hey ding-a-ding ding, sweet lovers love the spring. As they marched along, keeping time in song and step, all the birds of the forest obliged with a shrill and chattering chorus from hawthorn, oak, and holly. "Dost thou then believe, Orlando," asked the Duke, as he and his followers, with Oliver and his Aliena among them, crowded into the misty chapel of sunshine that was the place appointed for the lovers' meeting, "that the boy can do all this that he hath promised?" "I sometimes do believe," said Orlando, and then with a sigh, "and sometimes do not." And the little pages went on singing, "These pretty country folks would lie, in springtime, the only pretty ring time," until suddenly they fell silent, as like a bright phantom passing through the golden pillars of the sun, Ganymede appeared, leading Silvius and Phoebe by the hand. Gravely the youth surveyed the assembled congregation and then addressed the Duke. "If I bring in your Rosalind, you will bestow her on Orlando here?" "That would I," returned the Duke gladly, "had I kingdoms to give with her." Ganymede nodded and turned to Orlando. "And you say you will have her when I bring her?" "That would I," promised Orlando, "were I of all kingdoms king." Now it was the turn of Phoebe. "You say you'll marry me if I be willing?" "That will I," cried Phoebe, all aglow with hope, but Ganymede raised a warning finger. "But if you do refuse to marry me, you'll give yourself to this most faithful shepherd?" Phoebe thought. She frowned, she sighed, she looked at Silvius, and she smiled. "So is the bargain," she said. Then Ganymede, reminding each and all of their solemn promises, beckoned to Aliena, and hand in hand the mysterious brother and sister departed into the forest. "I do remember in this shepherd boy," frowned the Duke, "some lively touches of my daughter's favour." Orlando agreed. He too had fancied he'd seen something of Rosalind in Ganymede, and had wondered if he could have been Rosalind's brother. "But my good lord, this boy is forest-born," he began to assure the Duke, when Jaques, his melancholy face crumpling into smiles, announced, "Here comes a pair of very strange beasts, which in all tongues are called fools." Sniffing out weddings like dogs to a dinner, Touchstone and Audrey emerged from among the trees, he crowned with a chaplet of ivy leaves, and she in her best attire, with her shining happy face poking out from ruff and bonnet like a festive mutton chop. "Salutation and greeting to you all," cried Touchstone grandly, perceiving that he had fallen among courtiers and gentlemen, then, feeling that his choice required some explanation, presented her to the Duke. "A poor virgin, sir, an ill-favoured thing, sir, but mine own. A poor humour of mine, sir, to take that no man else will." He gave Audrey a shove to indicate that she, in acknowledgment of the tribute paid her, should curtsy gracefully, so down she went as if to milk her goats. "Bear your body more seeming, Audrey," urged her lord, as he engaged in a battle of courtly wits with Jaques, but she could only gape in wonderment as his words, of which she understood not one, flew as fast as fat from a pan, and he, seeing her looks, was well content with his choice. Admiration was much to be preferred to equality. Suddenly there was a noise in the forest, a strange noise that stilled the birds and hushed the waiting throng. It was a slow, mysterious music, accompanied by solemn drum beats like the beating of the forest's heart. A soft breeze began to blow, and the air was filled with a sense of spring. The music grew louder, and the trees trembled. Then the sunbeams seemed to part like golden curtains, making way for a tall, smiling youth in marvellous yellow robes and bearing a torch. It was Hymen himself, the god of marriage, who had come to bless the day. Gently, he led by the hand 2 shining princesses to complete the fourfold forest wedding, and so bring the promised marvels about. Amazed and joyful, the Duke recognised in the true princesses his daughter and his niece. Oliver, his poor shepherdess Eliana in the Princess Celia, and Orlando, his true love in the one-time Ganymede. "If there be truth in sight," he breathed, "you are my Rosalind." "If sight and shape be true," sighed Phoebe, no less amazed but not so joyful to see her Ganymede lost for ever in the fair Rosalind, "why then, my love, adieu." She sighed again, and turning to the ever-loving Silvius as the better bargain and most true, promised, "I will not eat my word now thou art mine," and Silvius nearly died of joy. Then Rosalind united all the lovers' hands, and they knelt for the god to bless their marriages, while the little pages sang, "High wedlock then be honoured, honour, high honour and renown, to Hymen, god of every town." All promises had been kept, but the forest was not yet done with its wonders. The last was still to come. Even as the god departed, and a multitude of joyful explanations broke out, there came a gentleman, flushed with haste and stuffed with news, from Duke Frederick's court. That wicked man had taken it into his mad head to set out with a mighty force to seize his brother and put him to death. But no sooner had he come within the charmed circle of the forest than he, like Oliver, had been changed and converted, not by means of serpent and lioness, but by an old religious man. So powerful had been the words of this venerable person that the storms that had raged within the unhappy Duke were calmed. He had dismissed his forces, relinquished his crown to his wronged brother, and desired no more than a life of contemplation in the forest of Arden. So now all wrongs were righted, and banishment was at an end. The restored Duke turned to his faithful followers and promised, "Every of this happy number that have endured shrewd days and nights with us shall share the good of our returned fortune." At this there was loud rejoicing, and many a cap was flung into the air. Although in their forest days the courtiers had learned to find, as the wise Duke had once told them, tongues in trees, books in the running brooks, sermons in stones, and good in everything. There was no doubt that soft beds were to be preferred to hard turf, and a sound roof to a leaking sky. The melancholy Jaques alone was of another mind. He, in his time, had seen everything under the tired old sun, and looked only for something new. He chose to remain in the forest, and seek out the company of the changed Duke Frederick, there being more to amuse him in a bad man made good, than in a good man made merely better. "Stay, Jaques, stay," begged the Duke, but he would not. With a smile and a bow he departed, leaving dancing and merriment behind, and the two little pages singing their hearts out. "And therefore take the present time, with a hey and a ho and a hey nonny no, for love is crowned with the prime, in springtime, the only pretty ring time, when birds do sing, hey ding-a-ding-ding, sweet lovers love the spring."
Shakespeare Today by Dr. Rex Gibson. Shakespeare is alive today. Although William Shakespeare the man lies long buried in Stratford-upon-Avon parish church, he lives on in countless millions of hearts and minds. Imagine that cold April day in 1616. The small funeral procession labours slowly along Church Street. Huge black horses draw the wooden cart bearing the simple coffin. On the coffin, a few daffodils and primroses, plucked only minutes before from the garden of New Place, gravely nod with each jolt and jar of the rutted road. Most of Stratford's citizens have turned out, muffled against the biting wind, to see the last appearance of their wealthy neighbour. You couldn't call it a crowd, just small respectful groups clustering the dry places on the roadside, careful to avoid the mud splashed up by the great hooves of the lumbering horses. Men and women briefly bow their heads as the dead man and the black-clad mourners pass. The townspeople share their opinions, as neighbours do. "He used to do some acting, didn't he?" Made a lot of money in London, writing plays, I think. He used to come home once a year to see his family, but nobody here really knew a lot about Master Shakespeare." "Wasn't he a poet?" Big landowner hereabouts, anyway. All those fields over at Wilcombe." past the guild chapel where he had worshipped as a boy, past the school where long ago his imagination was fired by language. At the churchyard gate, under the sad elms, 6 men effortlessly heave the coffin onto their shoulders. William Shakespeare is about to enter his parish church for the last time. Nobody at that long-ago funeral guessed that they were saying goodbye to a man who would become the most famous Englishman of his age, perhaps of all time. Shakespeare lives on. He weaves familiar themes into his tales, the conflicts between parents and children, love at first sight, the power struggles of war and politics. His language is heard everywhere. If you ever call someone a blinking idiot, or a tower of strength, or describe them as tongue-tied, or suffering from green-eyed jealousy, or being dead as a doornail, you are speaking the language of Shakespeare. If you say, "Oh, it was Greek to me," or "parting is such sweet sorrow," or that something is too much of a good thing, and that you have not slept one wink, the words of Shakespeare are alive in your mouth. Shakespeare's language has a power all of its own, rich in emotional intensity. Because he was a poet who wrote plays, he could make even the simplest words utterly memorable. All around the world people know Hamlet's line, "To be or not to be, that is the question." Shakespeare is still performed today because of the electrifying power of his storytelling. Whether his story is about love or murder or kings and queens, he keeps you on the edge of your seat wanting to know what happens next. He created well over 900 characters in his plays. However large or small the part, each character springs vividly to life in performance. They live in our imagination because they are so much like people today. They experience the same emotions that everyone feels and recognizes: love, jealousy, fear, courage, ambition, pride, and 100 others. In every play, Shakespeare invites us to imagine what the characters are like. And for nearly 400 years, people have accepted Shakespeare's invitation. The plays have been reimagined in very many ways. They have been shortened, added to, and set in very different periods of history. They have been translated into many languages and performed all over the world. Shakespeare lives because all persons in every age and every society can make their own interpretations and performances of Shakespeare. You too can make your own living Shakespeare. Try reading the play either by yourself, changing your voice to suit the different characters, or with friends, and record it on a tape recorder. If you have a toy theatre, try staging it with characters and scenery that you make and paint yourself. Or collect together a cast and create your own production for your family and friends.